In episode 7, we traced Brian Patrick Miller's path to Everett, Washington, where he lived in the early 2000s. It was around that time that 14-year-old Victoria Michelson was attacked on a trail. 25-year-old Melissa Ruiz Ramirez was stabbed after hitching a ride with Miller. And 37-year-old Kelly Sarston's body was found in the Pilchuck River. Miller was tried and acquitted of attacking Ruiz Ramirez. He said it was self-defense. Phoenix police believe he is Michelson's attacker, but the statute of limitations in Washington has run out, so he would not face charges in that case. And Miller was not linked to the Sarston murder, although family members still wonder. Brianna Whitney picks up the investigation from here.
We don't start off with the level of violence that happened with Angela in 1992, and then 10 months later you have Melanie with some type of fantasy acts that are particular to serial killers. It looked like it was something that was created in Hollywood, a serial killer type scene.
This is True Crime Arizona, The Zombie Hunter.
Troy, and last name's Hillman, Hillman.
This episode is one I've been waiting to record and release for months. Troy Hillman was a cold case homicide sergeant with the Phoenix Police Department. I say was because before sitting down for this interview, he retired from the police force just days prior.
So this is the first time you've really been able to talk about this case at all?
Yes.
Is there things about the case that you've been wanting to get out there that you have not been able to talk about until now?
Absolutely.
Nobody has heard Troy Hillman publicly talk about this case before now. He's a major part of why Brian Patrick Miller's arrest was ever made. Because Miller's trial is still ahead of us, there are details he can't reveal yet to not put the case and trial outcome in jeopardy. But Sergeant Hillman has had a story to tell for years, and now he finally can.
When did you get put onto this case, or it was part of your workload in terms of the Canal Murders and Brian Patrick Miller?
So 2008, I took over the cold case squad, and we started building and figuring out what cases we had and what cases we didn't have. We decided to work case as a team, and we had talked about it after finally building this group of, again, what I consider an elite group of detectives. I came across, actually, it was a public records request on the cases, and I had the painstaking job of looking at, not too much information was released so that we could still potentially proceed with the cases. With that said, I was shocked at what had happened and the degree of violence. What I considered it was a serial killer. It just had to be, because there had to be. You don't start off doing what he did to Angela and then with Melanie about 10 months later and then just drop off. So there had to be some pre-crime and post-crime. So I think a group of detectives, we talked and we said, hey, this is the one, we want to work as a team. And that's kind of what kicked it off in the fall of 2011.
Angela Brasso was decapitated in 1992. Melanie Burness was murdered in 1993. Both were killed along the Arizona Canal while riding their bikes. Hillman's team had the matching DNA from both crime scenes. Studying the case file was step one.
At that point, the Canal Murders case was cold. I mean, there were really no pointed suspects at that time, right? There were maybe a couple thousand that you guys were looking at?
Yeah, over the years, the amount of information that flooded in collectively, was in the range of 800 to 1,000 or more names.
Are you able to describe some of what you read in those reports from the scene or the pictures you saw?
I can't really talk about the scene. It was quite devastating what the perpetrator did to those two women. But yeah, I can't really get into that based on it hasn't gone through trial yet.
Sure. We just know it was very gruesome. Would you say one of the more gruesome murders you've dealt with in your policing career?
Absolutely. It looked like it was something that was created in Hollywood as far as a serial killer type scene. So very, very gruesome.
You keep mentioning serial killer. What exactly is the definition of a serial killer? What makes somebody a serial killer, and why do you think the person who did this to Melanie and Angela is one?
It's multiple victims over a period of time, but it also can isolate at one incident. I think a person that goes in and does like a school shooting can also be classified as a serial killer. But your typical serial killer does a series of murders over, but it can last decades. In my opinion, when I looked at this case, these cases, I had the suspicion that, again, you don't start off with the level of violence that happened with Angela in 1992, and then 10 months later you have Melanie in 93 with some type of redressing and some type of fantasy acts that are particular to serial killers.
Now was the time to think of new ways to solve this. Hillman formed a team of crime analysts, experienced detectives, sex crimes investigators, missing persons investigators, and the crime lab itself.
And I remember the DNA supervisor told me, she said, "Troy, this case will be solved when you guys bring us the right DNA." So we just started looking at what did we miss? Is there anybody that we talked to initially? These cases happened kind of as DNA was taking off. So, and I think they went into the national database in '99, this unknown profile. So it really wasn't a thing. I think it was one of actually DPS's first cases that they entered into the CODIS database.
Who also joined you guys? Because I know there were outside agencies and outside companies that also played a part in leading to his arrest. How did you find those people?
So there was a group called the VDOC Society, and they're known as the modern day Sherlock Holmes. But they're a collection of brilliant law enforcement supporters, ex-law enforcement, slightly eccentric because they're so brilliant. But they actually invited us back to present Angela and Melanie's cases to Philadelphia in the fall of 2013. Two detectives and myself and a PhD volunteer for the squad, we all went back and we presented the cases. We met a gentleman by the name of Richard Walter, who was one of the founders. And Richard is quite captivating, brilliant. He's a forensic psychologist, criminal profiler, and he does crime scene assessment. All of them gave us a lot of information, and it kind of just was an overwhelming area that you typically don't go in like a homicide 101 investigator training class. You go, this was what I consider the upper echelon of law enforcement. So I became pen pals, and Richard Walter began helping us and giving us information about who we might be looking for. He said these kind of cases, he'll be in your files somewhere. The problem was our files were massive, and it could be decades before we got through all the files.
You'll hear Troy Hillman talk a lot about the VDOC Society and Richard Walter. Hillman told me it wasn't often police departments got to work with an organization like that, and he credits them for taking his knowledge of these kind of killers to the next level. At the same time, Hillman's team got an unexpected phone call.
I think it was the fall of 2014, one of my detectives forwarded me a voicemail from Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, and she is the forensic genealogist. I listened to the voicemail probably 10 times. I knew that my dad was kind of into Ancestry.com and that kind of thing, but I didn't really understand genealogy and how it could be applied to DNA work.
And it was kind of newer at the time too.
I always joke, it's kind of was a weird science. It was like, whoa, what is this? So I asked the DNA supervisor, Kelly, to go and meet with Colleen, who was presenting at the Biltmore. She met her and said, you know, you might give this a try. You might give it a whirl.
Hillman said it took 3 months of convincing his chain of command to let them give genealogy a try. There was worry it could hurt the case. But Hillman's thought was anything could help at this point. So they gave Colleen Fitzpatrick the DNA.
My name is Colleen Fitzpatrick.
And what's your title and your specialty?
I'm the founder of Identifinders International, and I am
You may remember we interviewed Colleen Fitzpatrick on episode 3 of the Zombie Hunter podcast.
I remember her calling me, and my extended family was in town, and she called me and said, I believe the last name is Miller, surname. I had to get to the office. I felt bad. My family was in town. I'd planned on taking off some time, but I was quite obsessed with these cases. So we used VDocs. He's in your files. And sure enough, he was in our files.
Were there other Millers? I mean, that's a common name that were in it.
Yes.
So when you look at the files, there's multiple Millers. How did you narrow down?
This particular file, everything that Richard Walter had taught me about who we might be looking for and everything that the FBI had opined on in their profile spoke to what was in this particular file.
If Brian Patrick Miller was in the files on this case, that means years prior, he was looked at.
Why was he first looked at for the Canal Murders, but then that went nowhere?
I can't explain that. People have moved on, retired. I don't know. I could only speculate that there was a lot of just so many tips flooding in. I mean, tips would come in of, hey, here's a guy with a sword. You might want to check him out. So the police department was spread thin, really did a nice job of trying to vet all those out. But I can't really explain why Brian was not really looked at harder at that point. She expedited a process that I would like to think we would have got to.
I guess the one pretty important thing with that, though, is who knows what he could have done in those years had it taken much longer to identify him.
Absolutely. There's still a lot we don't know about Brian Patrick Miller.
Hillman and his team carried out an undercover operation at a Phoenix restaurant to get Miller's DNA from a cup he used. They turned it over to the crime lab. Fast forward about a week.
We were in a meeting talking about a grant, and it was kind of a boring meeting but needed to be done. And then in comes the lab, and they never come over here to our facility, and they said, hey, it's him, or it's a match.
What's going through your mind at that point?
After 3.5 years and many names on a whiteboard that I had crossed off, and many disappointments because we thought, hey, this particular guy looks good for it, or this guy looks good for it, I was speechless. I didn't know what to say. I think then that led to a kind of a euphoria, and kind of we hugged, and then it became, okay, we need to inform the SWAT team, and we need to inform our chain of command and get things ready to make an arrest.
It was Hillman who called Colleen Fitzpatrick.
I happened to be at a restaurant having dinner with a friend, and I saw Troy Hillman ring in. I said, excuse me, I got to answer this. And he says, we're right, that's right. Brian Patrick Miller, we've arrested him, and you were right. And at that moment, I went, oh my God, they got him! And the whole restaurant turned around to look at me.
He never seemed like the type of person to do that.
From underneath the patio, they pulled out a car we never even knew he had.
I just can't fathom it.
The SWAT team took Brian Patrick Miller into custody in January of 2015. He lived in a hoarder house, making the forensic search of it extremely difficult.
Was there anything in that house that was found pertaining or connected to the Canal Murders?
I can't say.
Hillman sat down with Miller for an interview after he was arrested.
So I know you can't talk about the interviews word for word, but can you at least touch on Brian's demeanor with you guys as detectives interviewing him after he was arrested?
Yeah, again, I can't talk about specifics, but I can say that he was reserved, cooperative, kind of shy. So other than that, I can't get into details.
Was there anything that struck you about Brian Patrick Miller? Talking to him, anything you noticed that stands out to you?
He was a phenomenal artist, and his drawing is something that I only wish I had half the talent, and I wish he had taken that to a professional level. But if I could go back and be a mentor back in 1990s, I would tell him, go pursue your art.
Do you believe he has committed other crimes like this?
It's my professional opinion, not the police department's opinion, my opinion that yes, he did. I think that, again, you don't start off doing what he did to Angela and then what he did to Melanie and then just stop.
I watched her go around the corner and there were tree groves there. So she passed in between them and I saw her in that moment, and then that was the last time I saw her.
In episode 4, we interviewed Kristen Dennis. Her big sister, 13-year-old Brandy Myers, went missing in 1992 while collecting money for a school book drive. When Brian Patrick Miller was arrested, his ex-wife Amy came forward to detectives that he had admitted he killed a little girl selling things at his store years ago, then cut up her body and got rid of it in the trash that went to the landfill. Miller lived on the same street Brandy Myers disappeared from. Once detectives in the missing persons unit learned all of this new information, they recommended first-degree murder charges for Brian Patrick Miller in Brandy's death to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office.
He's being looked at, and the Phoenix Police Department recommended first-degree murder charges for Brian for Brandy's murder, or presumed murder and disappearance. How did you feel when the Maricopa County Attorney's Office declined to prosecute Brian for her death?
I always tell family members that are upset sometimes by a turn down, they're the attorneys, they're experts at what they do, they get to decide. We take a case, work it as much as we can and put a bow on it and give it to them and say, please prosecute this, but it's ultimately up to them. And again, they're the attorneys that make those type of decisions, and I have nothing but respect for them over there. They're very, very good at what they do.
Is the most difficult part of the Brandy Myers case the fact that she's just not been found?
Yeah, always no body homicides are difficult, and you're looking at the amount of the time span that's gone by. It's a very difficult case.
It's been years of agony for Brandy's sister, Kristen.
I can't just let it go. I wish I could. I do. I wish I could just let it go, and I can't. I keep trying. Every time I'm knocked down, every time they turn down the case, I'm like, you know what? What am I doing? I'm not looking for any kind of extra time. Like, as the Myers family or Brandy's representatives, I'm not seeking time or the death penalty. I'm seeking an impact statement. That's all we want. That's all I need.
Do you believe he killed Brandy Myers?
Personally, yes, but I can't. I don't think at this point I could prove that, or we can prove that definitively.
What makes you believe he was the one that was responsible for her disappearance and likely death?
It just lines up with everything that I learned from Richard Walter and everything that we took away. It lines up with kind of his progression, and then the information that was given by his ex-wife at the time.
There's always been a lot of interest in the Canal Murders case. So many in the community have been waiting for justice for Angela and Melanie, and Brandy too. When they got the DNA hit on Miller, Troy Hillman could have never predicted the situation they'd be walking into. The zombie hunter? That piqued everyone's interest.
I want to get your take on the zombie hunter character. What do you think that was all about?
I think these types of individuals, from what I've learned from Richard Walter, are extremely, they're brilliant. They're off the charts smart. And I think they also tend to live in a fantasy world because they may not like the world that they're living in. So I think that may be an extension of the fantasy that he had. I think he was slightly intrigued with law enforcement based on some of his mother was a detention officer. And again, this is all just my opinion, but I think it was all just hiding in plain sight, what Richard would call a sarcastic irony to the fact that he was out parading around, taking pictures with officers, and had a vehicle that looked like a police officer's, and yet he had done these horrible acts 20 plus years ago. He told me that pathology trumps intellect. And at first I kind of had to digest that as to what's this guy talking about. But then I realized that sometimes if you look at even our everyday life where a person of high-ranking military person or a CEO of a company, they cheat on their wife, he would explain that that's their pathology. They know it's not right, they know they shouldn't do it, their intellect is telling them not to, but they do it because of their impulse, because it's their pathology. So he says a lot of these subtypes, he called them, basically act out on their fantasies. It's their pathology, and sometimes to the point where it gets them caught. Most of the time, these individuals are extremely intelligent, and they may not all be organized, they may be sloths, they may be well-dressed, they kind of run the gamut, but they're typically off the charts, and they're usually talented in the arts, either photography, drawing. They seem to be quite above average in those means. I think we had built the case before we knew he was the zombie hunter, and that just made it a lot more interesting for sure.
Did you expect something like that?
Not that in particular, no.
Do you think there are more victims that we don't even know about yet?
Potentially, I believe that there could be.
Or are you certain with the DNA match that he is their killer?
Well, again, it has to go to trial and it has to go through the adjudication, but from my personal professional opinion is yes, Brian Miller killed those women.
It's been nearly 7 years since Miller was arrested, and in a way that made history by forensic genealogy. So many people are anxiously waiting for this trial to begin.
The trial has been delayed quite a bit for the Canal Murders. Is that frustrating, or is it comforting in that you think it's because they're going to get this right and they're hoping for a conviction?
I can only imagine it's frustrating for the family who's kind of waiting for justice. Ultimately, that's what we want. We can't bring those girls back, but we can give them justice. And I think the longer this goes on, the more it lingers, and there needs to be some type of decision. The secondary kind of point from a frustration level from as the kind of the team leader on the cold case side is this is an excellent story about cold case detectives, about why it's important, why it shouldn't be defunded, why we need talented investigators that just stay on point looking at these older cases. We had a lot of doubters, both inside and outside the department, that told us he's been in the system since the late 90s, he would have hit, there's no way, he's dead, move on, you guys are never gonna solve it. And it was a collection of this group, and we said we're never going to give up, and we're going to try things outside the box. Basically, we tried the VDOC Society, and that was great to have a mentor like Richard Walter. And then we also had Colleen Fitzpatrick, who helped us with genealogy. And truth be told, we were, I think, one of the first agencies in the country to use it then in late 2014. And not that, again, I want to get in a match of who used it first, but when I hear that I think it was California used it first on Golden State Killer, we were groundbreaking, and I think Dr. Fitzpatrick brought that up, that we were the first to really use genealogy. So it's important to think outside the box and use different tools.
There's still a lot Troy Hillman can't discuss ahead of the trial, so this is just part 1 of the interview with him. There will be a tell-all part 2 with him after the trial is over. The case and arrest was such a success for this team that it inspired Troy Hillman to add another soon-to-be title to his resume: author.
You're planning to write a book about this case. Why this case?
Once it's adjudicated, I think that's important. I'm not going to do anything with the book before that. My take on it is I look at cold case squads around the country, and I've had fielded calls, and a lot of them are kind of fledgling. They don't know what to do, how to go about it. It's something that's just kind of that closet for most police departments. It's just like, oh, we've got all these old cases and we really don't know what to do with them and how to staff it. And I think that we came up with a really good formula for how to review cases, how to build a squad, how to pull in talented detectives, how to think outside the box. And I'm just proud of this journey that we went on to ultimately find Mr. Miller.
Next time on True Crime Arizona, The Zombie Hunter.
He was upset about the way he was being portrayed, as in he believed in zombies.
Yeah, that he was mentally unstable.
At that time, did you think police were going to solve this case?
Absolutely. They were absorbed in it. There were detectives who had a hard time sleeping at night.
I didn't know that he had stabbed someone as a child. I didn't know he ever had gone to jail.
Well, what are the signs of a serial killer? And one of them can be trophies.
The killer takes something
that he gets off looking at.
True Crime Arizona, The Zombie Hunter is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney.
And me, Morgan Lowe. Sergio Hernandez is the producer.
It's a production of Arizona's Family, CBS 5, 3TV, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.